Well, welcome everybody. This is the WILP webinar on Jane Addams, the Two Chicagos, and the rich and poor divide in today's society. And we are so privileged to be here to share some of these historical notes with you. And it's all thanks to the WILP US organization. We hope that you'll look at the addresses and where you can learn more about WILP and see more of these webinars. So this is a very great opportunity to show aspects of both global and local in terms of this WILP organization, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, founded by Jane Addams. Today's will be more on the lesser known local Chicago Jane. I'm Gloria McMillan. I'm in Tucson, Arizona, where I work at the University of Arizona's English department as a research associate. I have been involved with WILP for a number of years, and I'm from the Chicago area and have family ties there for multi-generations before the Civil War. I have written on the subject of Hull House, and I have written the novel that has to do with the development of Hull House and the divisions in the city of Chicago. So I'll turn it over to Mattius.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for that segue, Gloria. My name's Mattius Rischard, and I am also an affiliate of the University of Arizona. I am a graduate research assistant in the writing program, as well as in the social, cultural, and critical theory program at the U of A, where I specialize in the history and the discourse of urban mapping, both in literature proper, as well as in popular culture and in sociology, in the sciences. And so Gloria and I have been working together at the U of A on a forthcoming reference text that Gloria is editing called the Routledge Companion to Literature in Class, for which I was a contributor of an essay dealing with the ways in which urban spaces are divided socioeconomically, as well as culturally and racially in some instances. And with some of my studies, also in the upper Midwest, I found kind of a fitting niche here with Gloria in terms of our research together. I found that these socioeconomic divisions and cultural divisions of space in rhetoric matched the themes of the play she had written about deindustrialized and overlooked Gary, Indiana, and our collaborations have been very mutually beneficial. So we are very pleased to share some of what excites us with this audience, who already appreciates and understands Jane Addams, coming from the WILP background. But we want to help you understand also more generally how cities become emotionally charged and mapped by social scientists, activists, artists, much like Jane Addams herself, who shared many of these roles, both herself and others. And so we're happy to share some of her work with you today.
Should we start over? All right, well, we went a little far ahead. But this is the question that was Jane Addams' problem. How can I or we say who we are without saying who we are not and what is wrong with them? She constantly had to deal with this problem as she moved into a world that was so much more ethnically, racially diverse than what she was used to. And so what Jane Addams did was to enlarge the we and try as best she could within her time and the limits of anyone's abilities at that time to broaden the room at her table. So I'm going to just leave for a moment, give some silence, and think about this sentence before we move on. Okay, Matt.
So jumping off of that very poignant question that Gloria pointed out, oftentimes representations of people, even those who may just live next door to us, become very divisive and function rhetorically to separate people from each other, especially marginal groups from, say, a dominant cultural group. And so perhaps you've heard this term before, beyond the pale. It's a common enough idiom to kind of refer to people who are beyond civilization, beyond salvation, beyond education. And so where this term specifically comes from, just etymologically, is from the imperial period in Tsarist Russia, wherein the Jews, if they wanted to retain their ethnicity and their religion, were designated to exclusively habit this area in southwestern Russia, in what would today be kind of the border region between Poland, Belarus, and Ukraine. And this was referred to as the Pale of Settlement, a place where the Jews could settle away from the Russian Orthodox population. And so, of course, it has a formal term in Russian, but essentially the Pale of Settlement became this zone wherein the people within it were seen as somehow fundamentally or essentially different from the dominant group, the dominant society. And that's because of all the popular representations, the stories, the narratives that are told about them. And so in the United States, in our own kind of backyard here, in the late 19th century, this pale of immigration, this pale of settlement, could easily function as a term for those that we refer to in our own ghettos and our own immigrant areas and our own deindustrialized kind of migrant, places that where there's a lot of migrant labor, where there's a lot of food insecurity, these places where we have these kinds of constant negative representations in the media, because they are seen as beyond the pale, right? So this is the problem that we're focused on.
Shall I move on to the next slide?
Yeah.
Okay.
So moving beyond the pale takes a lot of collaboration, obviously. Even Jane Addams herself, who worked to move with those people who were located in these pales of settlement in the United States, she couldn't do it alone. And so creating these networks of support and of kind of mutual understanding, even between groups that are radically different, became very important at the turn of the century during the industrialization of the United States and these mass waves of immigration that were coming to places like Chicago. And for instance, one person that moved beyond the pale in collaboration with Jane Addams was Rabbi Emil Hirsch, pictured here in the left-hand picture beneath the text, who became the premier rabbi of the Sinai Reform Synagogue in Chicago, probably one of the highest paid and most popular clergymen in the United States at that time, attracting something along the lines of 2,000 people every Sunday. And for his sermons, such that they had to build additional architecture to hold all the people in the synagogues. But he was seen doing lots of different kinds of social work with Jane Addams, whether it be working in the women's suffrage movement, whether it be kind of working with the poor immigrant Jewish community that would also have been in contact with her settlement house, and also in his own pulpit kind of advocating for women to begin rabbinic training. He was one of the biggest voices in Reform Judaism, and he kind of acquired this sensibility because he knew what it was like to come from beyond the pale, having himself been and his father, Samuel Hirsch, who you can see on the right here, pictured in one of his collected obituaries, was one of the major Reform Judaism rabbis of Luxembourg. He was actually the highest rabbi of Luxembourg in the late 19th century, and that would account for the German obituary there, mentioning that he's from Luxembourg and that he died in Chicago, obviously moving to be with his son later in life. but they were kicked out fairly early on in his career, moving to America, his father's career, because of the strong anti-Semitic sentiment among the growing kind of nationalist movements of Luxembourg, Germany, France, all these places. And so coming from that background and understanding and being sensitive to this kind of segregationist attitude when it comes to representation, Rabbi Hirsch was very much a part of this network of people in Chicago who would be sensitive to needing to change the story about those beyond the pale.
Shall I move to the next slide?
Sorry, I was about to say that.
All right. I thought I would discuss a little bit about why Hull House was non-denominational. And I think you got a hint of that in the fourth slide about Rabbi Hirsch and Jane Addams. Well, she worked with Catholics, Jews, atheists, agnostics, Protestants, Buddhists. Anybody who came into Hull House was someone she was interested in and working with. So although she had a background, I believe, in Cedarville of attending Quaker services and sometimes Presbyterian services, but she didn't want to be known as a Protestant. She didn't want to be known as any denomination. She tried to avoid that all of her years living in Hull House because she was in a patchwork quilt of about 70 different ethnic groups and their religions, and some of these did not get along as well as they might, and some of them were divisions from the groups that she was from. So I think logically it shouldn't take that long to explain all this. That's why she was very eager not to be a denominational settlement house in the Hull House area. So moving on to slide 6. And you see a number of the people who came from Hull House, who went on to do various important work, both for women and to help people come out of poverty and help to empower themselves into ways that they could work into a more livable situation. Jane Addams was one of the few who actually allowed the voice of the immigrants. This may seem strange. You'll read about people who helped this group and that group, but it's always their own voices. Suffragists, it's always their own voices. It's not the poorest women in their group. But Jane Addams was different in this. She actually put out maps and papers in the late 1890s, and she allowed 3 of the immigrant community from 3 different groups to have a chapter in her book. That was unheard of. Usually it's our voices, us privileged people, talking about those poor people. So on the left, you have one of the 3 immigrant writers in Hull House maps and papers. Her name is Josefa, or Josephine in English, Humpel-Zeeman. She was the only woman, and she was fairly young. So I'm going to talk a bit about her, perhaps a little more than the other 2, but that's just so you know who she is, because she isn't given perhaps enough attention in the history of Hull House. And Jane Addams certainly wanted to divide the conversation between herself and the immigrant writers. So now I'm going to move to the next slide, and I believe Matt will talk about that.
So I'm glad that you brought up the relationship to these other suffragettes and who gets a voice at Hull House and who doesn't, because that's a great, I guess, introduction to this idea that Hull House wasn't always in a positive relationship with everyone, but it was also, I would say, making some of the best attempts historically and in that area to do so. And you can see in this diagram here, Jane Addams, Ida P. Wells, and Frances Willard being kind of portrayed in a triangle here, in a trialectic relationship, if you will, where they're all kind of existing. Their programs were all kind of existing in tension with each other. Jane Addams, of course, was very much for the suffragette movement, as was Frances Willard and as was Ida P. Wells. But when it came to issues of race, where Ida P. Wells was very much engaged in the anti-lynching campaigns of the time. That in many ways alienated her from Frances Willard, who was very much more of a law and order kind of rhetoric at the time. And Jane Addams, in some of her earlier work, kind of struggled to not necessarily patronize to white readerships about race and anti-lynching campaigns and so forth, but nevertheless, to say that, to use a kind of rhetoric that maybe Ida Wells didn't appreciate, such as arguing that such methods as lynching don't work to deter the crimes of the underdeveloped, would be perhaps a phrasing that she used early on in her reform advocacy work that Ida Wells didn't appreciate. But they were seen having many luncheons together, appearing at suffragette movements together, and Jane Addams herself was very open to empathizing with this campaign and began to make some of her own personal appearances at Ida Wells events and participating very actively in the NAACP and its foundation of a Chicago chapter. Although there was a bit of disagreement about who would get to choose the leadership of the NAACP there in Chicago, they nevertheless had a nice give and take relationship that probably, the rising tide raised all ships. Whereas Frances Willard, while she did contribute a great deal to the temperance movement and the suffragette movement, one of the first women on the Northwestern University faculty, she was also courting the favor of Confederate suffragettes and women who, famously the widow of Jefferson Davis for the cause of the temperance movement. So that might cause conflict, as you could imagine, with the NAACP and the anti-lynching movement. So you can see how these relationships are in constant tension. They're held together by certain common interests, and also at other times, perhaps in contention with each other.
Okay, well, is it okay to move on to our next slide?
Sure.
Okay. I want to mention Stacey McDermott, first of all, because she is the one at the Jane Addams papers at Ramapo College in New Jersey, who has written an excellent essay, and I give the web address of it there, on the racial problems that were going on in the early Hull House days. So as a shout out to Stacey. To go on about Ida B. Wells, she had been run out of Memphis because of her newspaper there. A white mob had destroyed the press, and at that point she came up to Chicago. That's how she ended up in Chicago, and then spent a big part of her career in Chicago. In fact, they have a building named after her at the University of Chicago, the Ida B. Wells building. So this was an evolving relationship. At first, Jane Addams, she got the same newspapers everybody else in Chicago was reading, and a lot of it alluded to the fact that these men who were being lynched probably were guilty. And yet she was still sympathetic. She felt that some of them probably weren't, and it's no way to deter crime in any case to be barbaric. And that was her starting point. But later on, the more she heard and the more she learned from Ida B. Wells, that it was a terror tactic to keep African Americans in their places, and was mostly not tied to guilt or innocence of the people who were being lynched. So that's about all I have on this slide, and I just want to allow Matt to say anything he wants to, and then I will wrap it up and we'll move on to the immigrant pages.
Well, thank you for that, but I appreciate everything you said about Wells and Addams, and I guess it's just alluding to the fact that Jane Addams did have a great capacity for the productive side of empathy, and in being able to see the points other people were trying to make, even if it takes a while to fully understand them. The great capacity of Jane Addams and the Hull House was to break through those barriers that were created through these popular constructions of Black people, as a for instance,
I understand what you're saying, and I agree. And it's so hard. And we're seeing it today again, where potential allies remain separate because of the distrust, rhetorical distrust on both
Yeah.
sides.
There's such a divide that's created by all these texts and these stories and these pictures, and until you're never even talking to the person on the other side of that.
So I think it's very important to emphasize that Jane Addams she had a quick mind, and nobody has a totally open mind, but she would allow evidence to influence her, which is saying something, and we all know how hard that is. So this is worth studying more, the relationship between Ida B. Wells and Jane Addams. And you have a good start with Stacy McDermott down there at Ramapo College in New Jersey. Now, I would like to move on in our next group of slides to the immigrants and how Jane Addams included their voices right at the beginning of Hull House. And that will start in the next slide. The first one is Charles, I believe it's Zublin, and he was a sociologist who had been trained at Yale, and he was the first sociologist at the University of Chicago. But before that, he wrote this about the Chicago-ish settlement. And you can see where he names the first proto-synagogue. And he's at the bottom, near the bottom, he gives some of the streets. I didn't give you too much of that, but these are online in the homicide database at Northwestern, or I think you can probably read it at Project Gutenberg. It's another site online. So here it is. This is where the first person describing the Jewish community is doing it. I think he had other things to his credit. I believe he was on the board for the World's Fair in no, it couldn't have been the 1933 one. Maybe there was something he was on the board of. I thought it was one of the World's Fairs. I have to go back.
Yeah, you're right. It's one of the World's Fairs.
So it would have been the Columbian Exposition, I guess.
Because he was so interested in city planning.
Well, he couldn't have been that either, but another exposition. Okay. Yeah, he was an early city planner, and all of the city planners in the audience should find this of interest. All right, the second one is Josefa or Josephine Humpel-Zeman, and she was an editor of women's pages in Czech, but in the book that was put out by Hull House, she wrote in English. She was fully bilingual. She was a journalist and had done stories in other periodicals before she started editing the women's pages up above Ženský listy. And she had also been the secretary of the World's Congress of Women at the World's Columbian Exposition in 1893. So here's a woman who came with very little support and did all these things. She's beginning her essay talking about how big the Czech community was. It was at one point the second largest Czech city in the world. And we actually had a mayor in Chicago who was one of these Bohemians, Mayor Cermak. And it moved around, as many of the immigrant places did. She's telling where it was before the Great Fire, the Chicago Fire, and then it moved on, and then it became named Pilsen. And so she's going on, and she had many avocations or specialties. I think she was trained as a print setter, a printer. So she opened a print shop, and all of her employees and staff were women. And remember, I'm talking about the 1890s. And even the little girls that were the apprentices, they called them printers' devils. They were women, they were girls. So they were doing great, and they were having many jobs. All the Bohemians were sending jobs to this women's print shop, but they began to cut in too much into the men's print shops. And so the men began to argue in print. There was one editor she went at it with, and then there were some rumors it was all women, and after a while she just had to give up because there was a lot of, what do we call it, backlash. So she went back to Bohemia. I'll move on to the next slide. And she kept lecturing, and she went all over the province of Bohemia lecturing about women's issues, the rights for women. And it was probably similar to this one quotation I have from her journal, the Women's Pages, where Josefa says that women who are not given opportunities to read, work in public, or to become educated get caught in the fashion of being a savior, in gossip, intrigue, and not only devious and crooked paths, but paths into the muck, by which she meant that women who don't have the chance to read, become educated, and work can often become stunted and dangerous to themselves and the people around them. So she felt that in order to really broaden and become, I guess what we would say is fulfill their potential, women needed these things. And she was saying that in Czech over in Bohemia after she was just there for a beseda, that means a visit. But unfortunately, she had a cerebral hemorrhage and died very young at 36. And she had admirers in Bohemia, and they put up this Art Nouveau statue at her grave, and it's called The Soul Escapes. So that's about Josefa, or Josephine Humpelzeman. The third immigrant who wrote the remarks on the Italian colony of Chicago, was a very poetic and forceful man who was the editor of the progressive journal La Tribuna Transatlantica. So you can see in the way that he writes, he starts off poetically about the streams and rivulets of the Italian Chicago population that turn into a mare magnum, and where the Italians are located. You can see he really, this was further down in his essay, but once he got going, he really started listing mapping the boundaries. And as anyone who's lived in a city like New York knows, these boundaries are very definite. So here we go with the actual mapping. These are just descriptive maps, but oh, and I should say about him beyond that he started many clubs, and some of them were so, I don't know what a good term to use is, edgy. Some of the Italian clubs were so edgy that Jane Addams had to back out of one of them because she felt it might be a bit of a controversial thing. So next, I will hand this over to Mattius.
Okay, so this also comes from the Whole House Maps and Papers. These are a set of, I guess what you could call participatory maps that were drawn up by Frances Perkins and Jane Addams, using information given to them by direct reports from those neighborhoods, from the people who would come to Whole House and then show them around, which made them some of the most accurate in the day and some of the most specific to very useful kinds of information, very useful kinds of categories. For instance, the category here is ethnicity. We have on the side all the colors, right, coding each ethnicity here, and then we have what we might call concentrations of yellow on the bottom. Those are what are kind of squared at the bottom and at the top. We have a high yellow concentration at the bottom and a high blue concentration at the top, indicating the Italian and Bohemian populations. Those seem to be the most pronounced in this portion of the city, and the most concentrated. Other things you might notice that are of interest is that a lot of the fronts of the buildings are blank, right? Like they're not colored in at all, which might indicate that no one is living there, that they're storefronts. As you know, with the architecture in Chicago, these row houses sometimes had storefronts and then apartments on top of them or behind them. And there are interesting patterns to note here too, in terms of, For instance, a lot of the Italians, the blue concentrations, own their storefronts, right? Like the fronts are also blue, which might be indicative of the culture in that area as well. Italians, a lot of them are in restaurant industry, or in the food industry, or they might have family shops that kind of feed that community, as opposed to the Bohemians, many of which are working in industrial jobs where they're not going to be working on the front of their residence, right? They're not going to be using a storefront. They're going to be leaving the residential zone every day to go somewhere else into an industrial zone to work, which also might be indicated by the patterns you see here. So that's just a for instance of what these kinds of maps could tell us, even in the late 19th century.
Okay, well, do you want to move on to our second group of maps then?
Sure.
Oops, there it is.
And so this one here is an income map. So again, a very sociological category that we would consider to be standard today, but at this time, remember that this is very revolutionary. And so we have the cooler colors, black and blue, kind of representing the lower incomes, and then the yellow, green, and red on the higher end. And another interesting pattern that might be worth noting is that even though these are somewhat interwoven with each other, there's not a ton of segregation by block. What you do notice is that the poorer communities, or the poorer residents, the blacks and blues, are almost always on the interior alleys, right? So to get into those buildings, people are going to have to go down these alleys or these service access routes, or go behind a storefront to get to their residence. And so there is this idea here of not being seen, not being heard, right? If you're someone of low income, like your residence is not worth looking at, right? These more impressive facades and storefronts, and presumably nicer row houses with an entryway right on the street are clearly higher incomes for the most part. So that's another interesting thing to notice, perhaps, from a map like this.
Okay, we're moving on to our next slide. Mattius, you found this, so describe it for us, please.
Oh, yes. So those were some maps from the Whole House papers that really articulate kind of Jane Addams' strategy for mapping the city and for using that work to advocate for the conditions in those areas. But while these illustrations were really helpful by creating some sort of really persuasive and rhetorically effective visualization of the city, unfortunately, those pieces of evidence that method that she developed is easily co-opted by people with less, I guess you might say, less well-intentioned aims in mind. For instance, many of the journalists, sensational journalists, some from England, some from the East, coming to Chicago, in the years following her work, would create these crazy depictions, like you can see here in this picture of Dante, the author, going into Chicago's underworld with his copy of the Inferno, and being so shocked that he wished he had seen that before he had written his book. But essentially, these kinds of authors, for instance, this picture comes out of the Robert Harlan's The Vice Bondage of a Great City in 1912. This typified the early 20th century portrayals of Chicago as being this vice-ridden, crime-riddled murder capital of the world, essentially. And the book's subtitle was actually "Chicago is the Wickedest City in the World," punctuating that idea of not only that it's a bad place and that good people don't go there, but also promising almost like a good time a promise of the taboo, to both titillate and sensationalize the tourist, but also condemn the residents of those areas, right? So that's an unfortunate outcome of how these maps and these portrayals became used once they were out of Jane Addams' hands.
Okay, so could I mention, in addition,
Sure.
there was a good sentence that you used when we were talking earlier that, let me get it right. The city maps are geometric and they're laid down in a grid, but above them is floating a cloud of attitudes and emotions. Isn't that good? I like that. So maybe we're ready to go on to the next slide, of attitudes and emotions.
Definitely. Would you like to describe this one, or shall I?
Well, we can both. You can do the main one because you're our specialist really on this mapping. So I'll add to it.
Well, I think what this slide highlights is that maps themselves are a kind of rhetoric. That there's a city, right? There's a city that's a given. It's certain blocks in a certain place, but we fit our sensibilities and our feelings about, and our morals and values and beliefs over those cities, right? And this map, which comes from William Stead, the British muckrakers collection, If Christ Came to Chicago, highlights a completely different overtone, if you will, a completely different message being sent with some of the same areas of town, right? And so he's mapping this street near Polk Street here, of all the brothels and the pawnbrokers, the saloons, and the lodging houses for unsavory customers. So here, this doesn't tell you anything about the incomes of the area, or the family sizes, or the number of single parents, or the food insecurity, or the income. This tells you nothing about the state of affairs of the people living here, except what immoral practices are believed to be going on there.
Could I add another aspect? We diverge
Sure.
a little in our opinion of Stead. I think much higher of him, actually. Because what he's doing is he's mapping the places, and he's showing how that the predatory capitalists own all of these places. And what his book's refrain is that the people who do the vice aren't doing it because of their genes, they're doing it because of the way they're being exploited economically. So he even goes into one of the brothels, or many of the brothels, and he interviews people, not only in brothels, but all kinds of people, politicians, bishops, ministers, all kinds of people. And he sort of does a Studs Terkel, if you remember him, style of interviews with many people. One is Maggie D., an Irish girl, who tells, that's, I think, maybe one of the most lengthy narratives, where she tells about how her whole life led to being a prostitute, and that, he goes on saying that these are not generally very long lives. So this is my take, is that he had a reason, and we'll go to that in the next slide.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, well, the person with the circle was probably the most disliked man in Chicago, one of the wealthiest, Charles Tyson Yerkes, who was the founder of Yerkes Telescope and Observatory, because he was an amateur astronomer. However, he built his loop railway system. He was a street railway tycoon, and he built it all at street level. So everyone was getting killed. There were so many people losing limbs. And they would say to him, why don't you put in more cars or build a few overpasses or something so that everyone won't be sitting on the streets missing arms and legs in downtown Chicago? And he said, well, that's too bad. It's not my problem. These strap holders pay my dividends. So you can see why he was a popular man. And in this picture, he has one hand removing the coins from the collection basket. The other one, that's a streetcar on the side. So the same Stead that did the maps of the brothels, this is the frontispiece illustration. Then to the right, Stead also did something that made him almost get tarred and feathered, was that he ran the who actually owned these places as an appendix in this book and named them and told their addresses. So you can see I circled a couple of them. One is all the way out in Santa Monica, California. This T.H. Shintz was fronting for many estates, people who had estates, and he was, if you look up, you can see his name several times, and it's people's estates, and they owned these. You can go from one column to the other. And as Mattius said, yes, it can be used against the people who were the ones who were the prostitutes or whatever, but he certainly didn't intend that. And I think that was unique too, because all of the other reformers did intend that it was the vices of the people themselves, whereas he took a very different tack, was that they were made into what they were made into, more of a naturalist tack by the conditions that they were forced to endure. And that made this book alone very unique among the muckraking. So could we, are you ready, or did you want to say something about any more about Steed?
No, I mean, this writing is what made him very dangerous for a while. You know, he's definitely more on the socialist end of the muckrakers, kind of a socialist naturalist in the vein of Jack London or Jacob Riis or something like that.
a lot like Jacob Riis, except more salacious, more risque,
more naughty.
But one thing you should know also about William T. Steed is that he died on the Titanic. He was invited to a peace conference, and he was one of the people, and actually is filmed in one of the earlier versions of these. You know, I think it was called A Night to Remember. He had a fascinating life, and he really did put his neck out for people. So I think that should be remembered. He's very, very well thought of in England and the UK.
All right.
Okay, now we're getting to the good stuff here. It was your map. You found it, so you can talk first.
So I just wanted to check in. Do you think you'll be wrapping up within about 10 minutes?
Oh, I think we can. What are we on now? Where are we?
We're at like 50 minutes, I believe. Since we started a couple minutes late, but
okay.
That's
okay. Well, we better zip through this one then.
Yeah, this is just another.
Not that far.
Yeah, this is just another, for instance, of the extent to which capitalizing on that sensational kind of mapping, that vice kind of culture in Chicago led to. This is a Prohibition era map, so, you know, a good 20 years later, where you see it's essentially a tourist map asking you to come and visit all these cabarets and sites where murders happened, and the poor conditions in the stockyards and the pollution of Lake Michigan. You can see the little subtitle. It's for bathing only. Don't drink it.
Okay, well, maybe we better speed up on just this map because it's
of course.
Disney. Okay.
Yeah, so it's just another instance of this sensational attitude taken to mapping.
And it was both. And I want to say one thing: the gangsters were all up all the way into Wisconsin, so putting them here is a bit biased. It wasn't just the South Side. Okay, moving on. All right, so we went over this, Mattius. I think, you know, it's
I've kind of made we've made the point that there's differences in the way that Hull House meant to do this method versus how it became later in the kind of reform movement of condemning these ghettos, if you will. So
okay, well, we would have said more, but we're a bit pressed for time. Mm-hmm. So go ahead with your comments on these different quotations.
So just to speed things up to today now, and what this has led to, I don't think that this rhetorical attitude towards the city, the inner city, has ever really gone away since then, especially after the War on Poverty and the Great Society of the 50s and 60s. You know, post JFK, post LBJ, what we're seeing is Nixon beginning to cut welfare while appealing to the rural and suburban voter bloc that makes up a good chunk of the Republican base. You know, that the cities are the problem, right? And by the time we get to Ronald Reagan, he's so disconnected from what's actually happening in the cities that you see him here. This is a quote of him speaking to his HUD secretary, the only African American in his cabinet, on his first visit to Detroit. He thought he was mayor of Detroit. He happened to be black, and he had no idea. So you already see the vacuum forming between the people who are supposed to administer these areas and
it's bipartisan because Joe Biden also has one about what he did, which was essentially doing the same kind of, just crack down and not really worry about these places.
Exactly.
Crack down. All right.
For Democrats to win elections, they have to show that they're as tough on crime as the others.
Okay, Mattius, we really got to speed it up. We really only have about 9 minutes. Okay. Here we go. This is a little cartoon that sort of makes it clear what MAZs are, and they're beyond the veil. Media and cultural avoidance zones are the holes. You can read these in a second or two, and it gives you the whole picture that our affluent places are the meat of our society. They are the cheese. The holes are the places that aren't making it economically. So they have no representation. You don't hear from them. You don't hear from their own sources. And this leads to more and more skewing.
Mm-hmm.
Jane Addams ran for and became the sanitation inspector of Chicago's 19th ward. And you may think this is from that ward, but no, it's from Gary, Indiana. That's today's equivalent. So that we don't need to dwell on that too much, but she did the real work of going around and inspecting all the garbage bins and the dead horses. But today, we're in today's world, and perhaps, Mattius, would you just say what hyperinvisibility is?
So generally what this term means is hyperinvisibility is what we consider to be the phenomenon, if you will, that upholds a media avoidance zone. So if the popular media and sociologists are ignoring a ghetto or a deindustrialized area such as Gary 99% of the time, 1% of the time when there's a riot or a giant fire or something, suddenly there's all this camera coverage of the area, right? So on 99% of the time, an area like downtown Gary is invisible and irrelevant. And then 1% of the time, it's hyper visible. It's all over the news. It's this place where all the dangerous people, and that being represented on those extremes makes it impossible to establish any kind of humanity for the people who live there, right?
Right. So moving along again, we'll move on to what can be done. And here's something coming out of Gary and Northwest Indiana, also extends to Southeast Chicago. So Mattius, you found some of this. I think you were the one who brought these in. And Thomas Frank is from East Chicago, Indiana, and he's an environmentalist and an artist. And he gives a toxic tour. That's part of his art of Northwest Indiana. And here are some of the other artworks and what they may achieve, especially down in the bottom. There are a number of benefits from doing artwork from, the people in the area itself doing the artwork, because then they begin to cut through the stereotypes and they begin to affect the suburban audience and to see that they are not different as human beings. And it also condemns the erasure that they're suffering, which is what Jane Addams did. And we're going to really move through these. Okay. Jane Addams had her own little classes with the people of her media avoidance zone, media and cultural avoidance zone. And these were the children and the adults who lived around Hull House. So this is a picture from one of Ellen Gates Starr's classes for young people. Now we're switching back to now. Here's the media avoidance zone of today. And you can see that they're out in the parking lot, probably of Indiana University Northwest, which is near. It's only blocks away from that devastation of 14,000 vacant houses, a downtown that's in ruins in many places. But these people are really working hard on finding ways to communicate social practice. They don't always do it with artifacts. They took this on the road to show that people from Gary are doing something, that they're really doing something about it, and they have aesthetic values, they have art. So moving along quickly. When you reclaim the local power to define a place, just doing that helps. So that these people are making a difference in the very act of going out and being visible from the place and doing art. Oops, I went too far. So here are some children, probably that same day, listening to shells and then sketching the shells or the little creatures set into the resin. It's very much like Ellen Gates Starr's activities and bringing in beautiful art. She brought in beautiful art, but also natural objects, and sometimes took them out of the Hull House area, out to see natural objects. Now we need to get through this. I hope we have time, because MAZs means no stores nearby and no healthy food, and I'm going to turn it over to Mattius.
Thank you. So just to cap off here, cap off the presentation, I think it's important to now hammer home, with all the technology we have, to produce maps, the sheer variety of different kinds of creative approaches people can take to those categories, like Jane Addams did, to advocate for the people in those areas and to demand their representation in a way that gets them the resources they need. Specifically in this instance, it's food, right? Here's a map of Chicago with the BMI, if you will, the body mass index, by zip code, with the addition of their food balance scores, higher scores for vegetables and stuff. But what you see is you have certain pockets with very high BMIs, and those tend to be areas here where you have single mothers, right? And so there's these maps almost coincide with each other perfectly. And the next page also illustrates a similar example, if you'd like to go to that.
I'm going.
So this is grocery store locations in Chicago, and you have a racial breakdown in the other map. So red areas have large distances from grocery stores. Blue areas are close to grocery stores. And then you have the different racial breakdown on the right. And what you see there is that the distance to a healthy grocery store, in terms of areas that are what we would call food deserts, areas without food, coincide almost perfectly with Black and Hispanic concentrations in Chicago as well.
Okay, well, we carry that around beyond the border because it's an ecology. Chicago includes East Chicago. It includes Gary, but it's convenient to knock them off. They feel they have enough to worry about in Chicago, so we'll cut it off at the state line. But I found this map, and it shows that these same food deserts are also in the industrial Northwest Indiana. And it's all part of the same, just like LA goes on from one city.
It's the same economy.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying it's the same economy.
Yes, it really is. So you see some perfect food deserts there. Okay, so this is our last slide, except for did you have something else you wanted to put in? Okay. We are really beset by these holes in the Swiss cheese, the MAZs. Jane Addams went beyond the pale in order to get to know people. And she used her intellect, she used all of her creativity to learn who these people were, to cross those borders. We know about borders and walls today. So she crossed all the borders in her day and found out that there were people on both sides. So what we hope we've shown, Mattius and I, in our presentation, and he may have some final words too, is that today we can make these connections. Now you know what Jane Addams did. You know what was really revolutionary about her. was that she actually moved and lived among those people. Only that day-by-day exposure helped her to see them as human beings, and also to give some of them chapters in the mapping book so that it wasn't just a one-way conversation. And I'm so pleased that we were able to show this to you. Mattius, do you have a final anything?
Yeah, I would just add that, she really highlighted how important representations can be in a democracy where we have to kind of advocate for the resources for our area, to be segmented off by imaginary lines. Anyone on the other side of the line aren't your responsibility. Like you were just saying with Illinois versus Indiana, it's like, oh, the people on the other side of the line are not our problem. And she didn't think that way, and neither should we.
Oh, thanks. So I guess this is, we've come to the end, except that we did have another slide with our works cited. So if anybody wants that, you can email me or just copy it take a screenshot of it right now and print it out somewhere. That's the modern thing to do. Just go print screen and you've got it. Okay, so we have come to the end of our presentation, and we hope there'll be plenty of questions. We're ready to take them.
Okay, I would like people who have questions, ideally, to raise their hands.
If I can get this out of here. Oh, stop share.
You can end share, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And if you have a hard time raising your hand, you can also actually raise your hand in what we see on the screen. But I'll call first on those who raise their hand, which usually you can do either under reactions or under participants. You'll find a way to raise your hand. But I will call on people who find some other way to call my attention to them. So we welcome your questions. Nada, did you have a question, or are you? Okay. I can't resist asking. Oh, Dr. Karen Clark, did you have a question?
Well, I don't want to cut anyone off. Nada, was that you? Were you speaking?
No. So go right ahead, please.
Okay. And, my title is up here because I use my Zoom. This is my Springfield College account. I am a social worker, and I am a professor of social work at Springfield College. And it's funny because I have my knowledge of Jane Addams is the reverse of what most of you have of her, right? So I knew her first when I was a graduate student at New York University, and I was doing one of my field placements at a settlement house on the Upper East Side. But it's the first class you take in your master's in social work program. You learn about Jane Addams. She is who we attribute to be the pioneer of our profession. And she's a hero. She's a hero of mine. And it wasn't until, several years later, I was overseas, I was Peace Corps at a Fulbright, that I became very interested in her work, her international peace work. And there is not a student who's been in a class with me in their graduate program who does not know the whole picture, right? The global picture of Jane Addams. But it's just so interesting that the women and men and the community of WILF come about knowing her from, the other side of it, right? So knowing her first globally, and then knowing of her work in the settlement house movement secondarily. Not later. I don't mean later like as an afterthought. I just mean sort of secondarily to her international peace work. But very much like her, what I have done in over 20 years now, my passion is working with refugees and immigrants in the inner city. And I have a question, and maybe just a thought exercise more than anything else, but it's hard right now, really, really hard. I live in Worcester, Massachusetts. Worcester is the most densely populated city in Massachusetts for the foreign born. Of the 6 New England states, Massachusetts is the most diverse of the 6 New England states, but Worcester is, it's the destination spot for the foreign-born. So a lot of great opportunity. However, we have with the previous administration, it's a much less welcoming place. And there are fewer and fewer people, well, they're still there, and I still know them, but fewer of them. And, we just have a lot of digging out to do to rebuild that capacity to serve the needs of the foreign-born, because it's bad. What this pandemic has exposed about inequality in this country, I just see it every day, and I'm sure many of you do as well. I had someone say to me recently, and this person was, under the influence of substances when she said it, the client out in the field, "You're nothing but a white saviorism. It's all about white saviorism." I don't know if any of you ever hear that term. Have you heard that term? Because I've heard it, I've certainly read about it. It's hard because you look at Jane Addams and, she was a peacemaker. It's not okay for us to say now that we don't see color, right? And people of color are struggling. They're struggling with that. Our motivations are to self-inflate, right? Or self-fulfill rather than alleviate their suffering or address the inequities and oppression that they need to, that they withstand in the pockets of poverty that they've been forced to live in. So, you don't have to say anything. It was just more of a share. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very insightful. I've heard some of these lines of narrative. Okay, anybody else have something?
So I just want to remind people that Gloria has put her email address up in the chat. So if you want her references, please go ahead and email her to request those rather than me sending them out. If you wish to download the chat, you can usually do that in various ways, which hopefully you can figure out. Usually at the end of the chat, there's some dots, or within the chat window, you'll see a spot where it says Save Chat. And
right,
you can do
I
that
see.
now, and you can do it at the end. I'll give people warning before I end the call in case you want to save the chat. So people have very much enjoyed the presentation, and I wonder if folks don't have some questions. I'm not seeing any hands up.
There's a couple. There's one. Robin.
Okay, thank you. Robin Lloyd.
Yeah, hi. Okay, I knew of Jane Addams through my family because my great-grandfather stayed at Hull House. And sometimes Jane would come up to his home in Winnetka. Henry Demarest Lloyd was a writer. And sometimes Jane and people who needed a place outside of the city would come up and stay at my great-grandfather's place. But my question was, and I missed some of the talk, of Florence Kelly. Did you mention Florence Kelly? She was an inspector of factories and was encouraged, and she lived at Hull House. So and I thought of her because I thought this report didn't, and I say I missed some of it, didn't stress all the positive things that Jane made happen, the proliferation of new categories, not just of social workers, but that she elevated the job of sanitation worker, and and Florence Kelly took a new job in the city, I believe, just to inspect factories. So
could I say a word here?
Yeah.
the Northwestern University has a whole database on Florence Kelly. And I did mention that during the presentation. I don't know if you caught that. We also listed her, I think, as one of the notable women. But because she has a whole database devoted to her, I thought that it was less urgent than we bring up some of the ones that are much less known. Another one we could have talked about was Alzina Stevens, who worked in the same areas as Florence Kelly, but gets much less credit for doing that. And certainly there were a number of women, but Alzina Stevens and Florence Kelly worked very closely together. And you can just type in the name Northwestern University and Florence Kelly, and you'll see a whole database.
I want to go ahead and call on Cheryl, who has her hand up. Great, Cheryl.
Yes, thank you very much. This has been very interesting. So this issue of the maze places, media and cultural avoidance zones, is this, so this is actually a long-standing problem or theme? And what could we do within WILF to get rid of these zones?
Well, for one thing, just talk about them and publicize them. I've gone to Frontline and every major magazine in the country trying to get any attention to Gary, Indiana. I have spent many hours writing to these venues, and all you have to do is type it in on YouTube and you can see it's a horrendous thing that's happened there. So what you can do is to just make it rise to awareness that we are doing this, that the coverage is the ratio is not the same. Places that are hurting get actually far less attention. Only if there is crime there, then they get attention. And so yes, Dickens, you sound as if maybe you're from England. Dickens and I see Peter Ponzio is here. He teaches Dickens. He made a lot of the MAZs. They just didn't have the term MAZs in his time, but that's what Dickens was writing about, trying to get people to see the full humanity of people living in those places.
Thank you. So it is a long-standing problem.
Indeed it is.
Thank you.
Dickens also had the advantage of a large audience for his fiction, which allowed him to create fictional equivalents, like Coketown, for instance, in Hard Times.
So are there additional questions? We have just a few more minutes before we're going to wrap up. And I can't resist asking a slightly irrelevant question, but Gloria, you mentioned the somewhat fringy Italian clubs. What was happening at these fringy clubs?
Oh, well, they were highly political clubs, and I don't know how much edginess you want in this talk, so we didn't go as edgy as we possibly could be. But just look up the name of that person, Alessandro Mastro Valerio, and he had a club named after Giordano Bruno. So if you look up his name, then you'll know how edgy this was. These were figures from Italian history that, big dividing line between people on these different figures. And he got into a lot of turmoil with other Italians in the neighborhood, so that Jane Addams eventually, I think it was the Giordano Bruno Club, I don't know which one, but she finally said, well, I'm going to suspend my activities with this club because she had to deal with everyone.
And what was Alessandro's name again, full name?
Alessandro Mastro, Mastro Valerio, Valerio. And the one was the Giordano.
You muted yourself somehow. We were hearing you fine, and right after Mastro, you disappeared.
Mastro Valerio.
Gloria, we can't hear you for some reason.
Well, maybe it's...
Fortunately, this didn't happen earlier in the program.
We can
I can hear her
but I think your microphone has died.
No.
I'm
I can hear her.
Darien, we can hear
So
her.
we may never know Alessandro Mastro's last name.
Valerio.
Oscar Valerio.
Valerio?
Yes.
Valerio.
Darien, Jane, most of us can hear her
Thank you. I think I must have muted myself.
or something.
Great.
Well, I'm
Thank
sure glad that you all could make it tonight, and I'm looking forward to many other of these Zooms from WILP, because this is a way we can really interact. Oh, thank you. Somebody did a clapping hands thing. Appreciate that.
I just saw the comment about Gary as well, someone having lived back there in the day, and yeah, it's important. It's important to recognize, I think, as Gloria once mentioned to me, like, you know, how Gary used to be represented in pop culture, like in the music, you know, in what is it, in The Music Man, or
right. Yeah,
you know,
Gary,
like there it used to be this. It had a completely different public visual, like, you know, kind of different optics than it does now.
We could even sing Gary, Indiana, Gary.
Yeah.
And EC must be East Chicago.
Yes, it
Yes.
is. So these are media avoidance zones, and I only gave ones that I'm familiar with, but I've traveled through the country and I know they exist all over. I mean, there are places outside of Sacramento or near the Bay Area that are just as depressed, or maybe not of the size of Gary, but they're never given that whole picture that you get in the more happier economic zones. But that's why Jane Addams is so relevant for today.
Unfortunately, much of the Central Valley of California is both an agricultural area and an economically depressed area that we hear very little about in the media, despite the large amount of Nazi and radical white right-wing activity that is centered there.
Well, I think that we used to pay more attention. I don't understand this either, but the whole California laboring migrant workers are not heard out here, or most of the country doesn't hear about them anymore. The people that work in those fields. They used to be, we would all be aware of them. I still get the mailings on Facebook from organizations that represent the fruit pickers and people, and I notice that nobody ever brings it up. Again, it's a media avoidance zone for some reason. I don't know. Maybe in California you hear a lot more about it, but believe me, the rest of the country, not so much.
Well, the migrant workers in California are having a hard time with COVID-19. Of course, they don't have a lot of access to flowing water and to good, uncrowded housing. So they're facing an essential worker status with typically insufficient worker protection.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us. We will put that up on the WILF YouTube page. A wonderful presentation. Thank you, Mattius and Gloria, really expanding our understanding of Jane Addams and her special insights.